Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest D.B. Buck, who is an author and educator. We will be discussing the book Stolen Voices, Sangbae Pieh, a powerful story of the Amistad Rebellion. So let's have a listen.
I just wanted to thank you, Devin Buck, for coming on to the podcast to speak about your book, Stolen Voices, Sengbe Pieh, I think that is the name, and for you to be able to speak about your book and the time frame period that is under, because I really enjoyed reading it, and I thought that it correlated to a lot of the things that we do as researchers of family history, and to be able to speak to it. So before we start, I'll have you just do a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll start.
Good morning again. Thank you for having me on. I'm DB Buck. I just published my book, Stolen Voices, Sengbe Pieh. You added a couple extra letters, Sengbe Pieh. But it's my privilege to have the opportunity to come on and talk about why I wrote this novel. And, I'd love to share with your fans the great history that's entailed within.
No, thank you so much. And before we start, can I just have you just give the reason as to why you wrote this book?
Okay. So for your readers who haven't heard of the book, Sengbe Pieh is the first-hand telling of the main character, Sangbae, also known as Cinqué. His name was changed when he got here to America. But it's the telling of his capture from Africa, his journey, and then his subsequent revolution on the slave ship, the Amistad. That, for me, is a very powerful moment in not just African-American history, but history in general. And I didn't feel that the stories or the narratives that were currently in the marketplace and in the world really told that story in the way it needed to be told. It's a very powerful example of how a person who was captured to be put into the American slave trade maintained his agency and ensured his destiny. We hear a lot about their victimization and how atrocious the Atlantic slave trade is, but we don't hear about the heroes within that story, right? The powerful men, women, and children who were actually there living it, who actually still had lives. One of the things that I like to point out about this story is Cinqué lived, it's hard to tell because of the history after he gets back to Africa, is very sparse, but they think he lived to at least 60 or 70. And all that we have in the history record is 2 years. This 2 years where he was touching the Atlantic slave trade. And so when you take these people and you only tell their story through that narrative, it completely discounts them as people. They're not people through the lens of the Atlantic slave trade. They are people who contributed to the story of the Atlantic slave trade. The people, the human, is the story we need to tell. And I don't feel like a lot of the things related to a lot of the stories that we hear related to the Atlantic slave trade, a lot of writings, they really miss that. And so that's why I wanted to put this out into the world.
No, thank you so much for that explanation. And I do appreciate that because, as I said, your book really intertwined a lot of the themes, a lot of the history. And speaking to that history, what were some of the historical references that you accessed for your book?
So the primary source that I used, many of the letters that were written by the captives on the Amistad are still in storage at the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian museums. And they have those available to access online. And so I read through all of those. And the thing that stuck out to me as I was reading them, and we talked a little before, we started recording, but I want to go through that again. But for me, we don't hear a lot from the captives themselves. Right. We hear a lot about them. We hear a lot from people who experienced them, but very rarely do we hear their own words because a lot of them didn't speak English, right? They were taken from somewhere They didn't speak the language, and they for sure didn't know how to write the language. And so those stories are lost. But in this instance, there is a treasure trove of firsthand documents written by them in the real time while they were experiencing this court case. And so to hear the emotion in those letters, and I did include two of them in the novel word for word. I included one from Cinqué and then one from one of the kids, Callie, who was introduced in the book. But Callie's letter in particular brought tears to my eyes the first time I read it. You know, you have this little 13-year-old boy pleading in a land that he's never heard of, never been, to people that don't look like him, that don't speak, and it's moving. And so that was my primary source. One of the things that I take pride in the novel, even though it is fictionalized, all of the plot points were actual history. You know, I didn't include anything that didn't actually happen. The fiction comes in the, you know, the day-to-day moments, the thoughts in his head, the conversations, because obviously we'll never know those things. But the things that happened in real life. And real people did experience those things. And for me, it's an important part of our history to continue that story.
Definitely a very powerful novel that you wrote. And as well, I know that we talked about it before we were recording, but I wanted to just touch upon your title of your book, Stolen Voices. Why did you go with that title?
So I use the term stolen voices because I'm very intentional in how I use words. So I'm an educator, and so I always speak to my students about being precise, right? I always joke, I don't like to repeat myself, so I'm very clear the first time. But that word stolen was not on accident, right? I don't feel it's an accident that all of these narratives are lost to history. You know, we can't forget how this fits into the grand scheme of American history. And we all remember the Jim Crow period, right? But in order to keep a people that oppressed, you have to tell them that you have no heroes. You have to keep people oppressed by telling them you can't do it because people like you can't do it. We've always had you captive, right? We're giving you this opportunity to enjoy these little bit of freedoms, even though we're still going to lynch you and, you know, beat you and you can't eat here. What you do get, you better appreciate, because people that came before you didn't even get that, right? That wasn't an accident, right? They purposely pushed that narrative. And so when you have people like Sangbae, who not only led a revolt, right? So he led this physical fight on the ship to take the ship back. He won in the American courts, right? He actually came over here and the Supreme Court decided in their favor, right? They had to get rid of that story. Right? If people knew about that story, imagine how empowering that would be, right? That story was stole from us. You know, it's interesting, like I said, so I'll just take a sidetrack down to the fact that I'm an educator, right? I've spent my career as an educator, but for me, most of my experience has been in all male schools. It's just one of those things, but I started at my very first school was an all male school. And I just happen to be very good with reaching the boys, because for some reason in the school system, they just can't get our young men, right? The boys just have always been an issue, quote unquote. But I do very well with that demographic. But to have these young men who consistently came in downtrodden, like I'd always ask them about their heroes, and they'd mention people like Steph Curry or Michael Jordan, who are fantastic people, right? Not knocking them at all. But I never heard about our Sangbaes. Right. I never heard not once them mention, I don't want to drop too much right now, but you know, this idea of stolen voices is going to be a series. So this is just the first one, but I'm going to be continually highlighting our heroic African and African American heroes. There were many revolts. You know, there were many opportunities where our people kept their agency and were able to be deciders of their own life. And so that's where the phrase stolen voices come from. You know, I think these voices were purposely ripped from the narrative of history because they're empowering. When you see your people doing amazing things, you want to be just like them. And they didn't want that. They stole those voices from us.
Definitely. Those are examples that can definitely be looked at too. So, as you should, you mentioned a lot in terms of with maintaining the history. And when I saw these two words that were mentioned in your book, I just wanted you to just kind of just to talk about the importance of this particular of these two words, which is Koro and Sorrow, and what they were, why they were used in the book.
Okay, so I I'm trying to figure out where to start on this because that was a whole. This book took a couple years for me to write because my first draft, I wrote it, and then after reading it, I was like, this is a very American telling of this story, right? I missed an opportunity here to really get some traditional. And let me make a point here. For me, I don't like saying African history because you minimize the fact that these were separate tribes. The Mende people were not like the Igbo, who were not like the Temne. You really minimize. So I want to be specific here. I wanted to include more Mende history. I wanted to include what Sengbe would have actually experienced in his life. Like how would he have grown up in his head? And so the Poro society and Mende culture is like their group of elders. They have two equivalents. So there's the Poro for the male, and then the Sande society for the ladies, for the women. And for the men, it's more so about protecting sacred knowledge. They are the keepers of the knowledge. They're expected to be the people that pass down traditions and uphold rituals and do all that sort of thing. But the piece that stuck out for me, so you're describing the scene in one of the early chapters where Sangbae's wife is wearing a mask representing the god Sowo, and the Bundu mask that she's wearing has this beard, right? And that beard for me is what kind of opened my whole mind on that, because the beard is representative of the fact that women are equal to men. In Mende society, there was no men are smarter in this way. They were considered to be equally wise. And so that beard, because they viewed beards as, symbolic of wisdom because of age, they included it on the masks that the women would wear because they wanted to symbolize how intelligent and wise they were as well. And so now you asked me in particular about Sowo. So from what I've learned, Sowo was a god. They had many gods who they didn't quote unquote. I don't want to use the term God because not in the same way that we would use it, right? It's not like a creator God or like some omniscient being. They use God more so in the term of like a spiritual being. They each have their own powers, their own abilities. And so Sowo represented the female wisdom. She was the god that represented the power of women. And so they have these intricately adorned masks. I mean, my God, I wish I could. If I had done a photo book, the craftsmanship that goes into making these masks is ridiculous. But each detail matters. The lines on the beard are symbolic of the age. The depth of the eyes is symbolic of the foresight. The hair intricately carved so that you can see the individual strands of the hair. It's just I love craftsmanship. I can appreciate hard work. And the work that went into creating those masks is just a story in and of itself. But, just to answer your question in summary, the Poro Society is a group of men who kind of lead the village, the village elders, and then the Sande Society is the women's equivalent, and they're represented by the god Sowo.
No, thank you, because these individuals, even though we may not know those particular names, but in our society is that, things are passed down through generations and we may not know as to why or where they come from, but just having a name to reference it, to know that these are the keepers of our history, of our knowledge, it is just a great symbolism to kind of show. And, this book does touch on some various serious themes. And how do you, as a writer, that you were able to express and convey this in a way that the reader is able to relate? Because sometimes this is not easy. It's not an easy task.
I wanted to start with experience, looking at it as if, what would it have felt like if I were there right now. Like the scene when Singbe first gets taken down into the slave ship. I sat there for a long time without writing, just trying to feel what it would be like. Could you imagine being taken from some lush, beautiful land and shoved into this dark, cramped space on an ocean you never, like, what would that have felt like? Because experience is the decider of your memory. People like to focus on facts and all what really, at the end of the day, your experience is what you're going to take away from it, and that's what I wanted to continually focus on. In every step of Sangbae's journey, I was asking the question, and what would this have felt like? Because that's what I wanted to put the reader through. I wanted the reader to experience really going through this progression, this. Because another thing I really want to emphasize here is that Sangbae is a family man. Family is huge in the Mende culture. They rely on their families immensely. So to be ripped away from that, is huge. I include in the novel 3 chapters told from Sahir's perspective. Sahir is Sangbae's son. And again, it was back to that same question, and what would it have felt like? So you wake up that first day and your dad is just gone. You don't know, you assume he's just out doing his normal daily duties, but so you go a couple of days and he doesn't come back. 3 days later, 4 days later, he's still not back. What does that feel like? What is that moment when you realize, hey, is he ever coming back? What is that like? And then to be on Sangbae's mind, he's 1,000 miles away. He has no idea how far, but he knows he's immensely far in a land that he traveled a whole ocean to get here. Even if his family wanted to find him, they wouldn't have a way, right? So how do you navigate that? How do you navigate, well, what if these people let me go and I'm free, but I still don't get to go back home? Then what?
No, definitely. As I said, these are all these different emotions, different themes. As I said, I just love the way that you were able to convey that. And then, as we follow the main character, which is Sengbe, how did his heritage shape his views and freedom, and justice? And how did it influence his resistance against slavery?
So I would say the first one has to do with a huge cultural difference of the fact that we take for granted that we're a written language society, and with that, a lot of things are black and white. You know what I mean? But also we lose some nuance, right? A lot of nuance is lost in that. Whereas when you're coming from this justice system that relies on the Puro and Sande society, where they're kind of making a moral judgment, at the end of the day, is it right or is it wrong? That's huge for Sangbae when he gets here, because the question is simple in his head. I'm a free man. I should be free. He's not, for him, trying to even explain the concept that there's a legal system, there are laws, this has to go through that, and this process turns into that, is foreign. It's like a cognitive disconnect, because like I said, in his mind, in his culture, they make decisions based off of the moral, the Sande and Puro societies, all their wisdom, all their foresight, it's based off of an internal feeling, and we really lose that in a society where we take for granted the fact that everything is written. I can go refer to the law and see what it says, and either it says this or it doesn't, and even though that is a small part of the story, to the heritage question more so, it guides everything. Even you look at one of the scenes in the beginning of the book, again, where Singbae is walking home from the hunt, and there's this. I included that because I specifically wanted to emphasize that heritage part. I wanted to describe the village, because one of the things we see, and I'll just say this now, it's one of the things that I hate that we're losing now in our culture, is that idea of a village. In their culture, in their society, village is everything. Their number one defense was each other. When things happened or when things went wrong in the village, you relied on your neighbors. That's why they built their huts so close together, because the village was the strength. you know. And so to be ripped away from that number one source of strength and still be successful, for me was a very powerful moment, because the theme that you'll see keep popping back up is Singbae keeps forming these new villages, these new families, and each group that he's in, it's a cultural connection. They all come from a similar, even though you're not my village, I get the idea of village, and so we'll be a new village. I rely on you, you can rely on me. We'll keep each other strong, and it's that strength that allows them to take back over the Amistad. It's that coming together, that unity, that I don't know what to call it. It's like you're drawn towards each other. A cosmic connection that we're just going to help each other be successful. So.
Well, for sure, because I do see the theme of Sangbae using his heritage in the book to how he relates to other individuals, even though they may not be from the same village or the same tribe, so to speak. But he always tries to find some way to kind of relate that to what he knows from his point of view and his reference point from that type of vantage point type of thing.
Yeah. And one more thing I want to emphasize there is how he not just his men, but he talks about some of the Mali Empire and all the Igbo. There's a lot of different history that's coming through because we think of him as history, but he still had a history that he learned, and he draws on that a lot too. The fact that in one of the scenes he's talking about Timbuktu and how. Not Timbuktu. I'm sorry, I didn't include that. This is the next one I'm working on. I'm sorry. But he talks about Mali and the Buntu mask that they're making and all this other stuff. And it's really a lineage of power. That's the word I was looking for. He's drawing on a lineage of power, not just from like his short term, but that long-term African history of the previous 1,000 years of kingdoms being built and being powerful, and just he's remembering that in this moment of weakness.
Definitely. And you definitely see that throughout the book for sure. And now we're going to go to, I guess, the rebellion. So what was the significance of that legal battle that followed the Amistad Rebellion? And how did, Sangbae's testimony influence public opinion on slavery?
So this was a pivotal moment in American history. So we have to remember that the reason this went to trial at all is because technically the import of slaves was disallowed. Obviously, the slave trade was allowed to continue, but one of the compromises they made was that they would prohibit the importation of new slaves, right? But of course, in any law, you're going to have criminals that break it. And so there were still plenty of black market dealers who were traveling to import slaves. Therefore, you end up with a very unique subset of people who are still. So right now in American history, you had the people who were dead set on we keep slavery, we need it, it's an important part of who we are as America. But then you start having this anti-slavery movement, the abolitionists pop up, and now they're getting more power, right? Because Adams was a president, right? So now he's got that clout, that, the power. Let's just summarize it like that. The political power to actually have a say, And so when you finally get this slave ship that comes in, it's kind of like the perfect opportunities for these people, these anti-abolitionists, to take it to court. They've known that it's been going on, right? There's plenty, it's clearly happening that they're clearly importing new slaves, but you don't have the perfect case to take it to court to actually get it ruled on. And if anybody who knows anything about the American legal system, precedent is key, right? For those who are not legal people, precedent is simply the idea that if a judge says something, even though it's law or not, that tends to be what other judges will follow, right? And so if you have a history of judges saying, well, in this instance, this is okay, we'll allow the slavery to continue. This instance, slavery is, they're searching for that opportunity where this is the perfect case where the judge has to rule this is illegal. And they found it here in the Amistad case because it is clear. And the thing that made this unique was obviously the slaves had the rebellion. They took back over the ship. On their supposed way back to Africa, they were captured by a U.S. Navy ship, right? And so there is clear evidence that they were not American, right? So you have the government capturing this ship on the open seas as they're in the process of coming to America. Cut and dry importation, right? That's what makes it the perfect case to take to the court because, again, importation is clearly outlawed in the law. I believe it's I would have to look, but I believe it's the Act of 1812 that finalized it. There was a compromise and they wrote the Constitution that, hey, we'll allow slavery to continue for now, but at some point in the future, we're going to look at that. And so within 1812, when they finally sat down and passed the law that said, okay, we're going to phase it out, and we're going to phase it out by stopping the importation, right? And they never continued the phase out, kind of just paused right there. But luckily that was on the books. And so you get them here to America, you have these court cases, but the other thing that really, sometimes in history, you have these perfect moments where things just come together, right? And where they got taken to in Connecticut just happened to be the place of all these academics, and I don't know what it is about academics, but they tend to put in the hard work when it comes to social justice issues. Because you have this group of people who really clinged on to that case from day one. And as much power as Sangbae had in his own fate, without these people and their American dollars that they invested into this case would not have turned out the way it did, because they put their money where their mouth is. They hired the lawyers. They did that kind of work, and I reemphasize that in this story because for all that is foreign to Sangbae. Like I mentioned, he can fight the battle on the ship all day long. He's a warrior. He can't fight a legal battle. That's not his kind of war, right? And so again, you have this synergy of people coming together for the greater good. And so it's one of those things, in my opinion, that it was just the perfect amalgamation of circumstances, where everything just came together at the right moment to make it work. Because the other factor here, I'm a huge Supreme Court history geek, right? In my opinion, the Supreme Court is the most powerful of the three branches, but I'm not going to get into all that. But it was the makeup of the Supreme Court at the time that, because had this happened 5 years later, 10 years beforehand, with a different set of justices sitting on that court, we can forget the amount of evidence that they had or how legal and cut and dry the argument was. It never would have happened, So this moment in history is what led us to this amazing result, because it's never happened again where a group of slaves got sent back. So,
yeah, it's not a story that, as I said, it's not a story that's even told, much less for this to happen in this type of a way. So now going back to the book with Sangbae's actions, how did this reflect in terms of his leadership qualities? And in what ways did they inspire others to resist the oppression in the book?
I think the most important leadership quality that Sangbae displays is his patience, right? The key role of a leader is to inspire and to decide, and so if you make that decision at the wrong point, if he had acted too early, he had either wound up dead or he would have been separated, but he's waiting on his perfect moment, and that in and of itself is a leadership quality, because you got to understand that my actions affect the group, and if I have the wrong action at the wrong time, the group will suffer. I've got to wait for the perfect opportunity, no matter how long it might take. It will come. I trust that my opportunity will come and I will wait on it. Right? That's number one. But number two is just his fortitude. Right? People are inspired by people who remain consistent throughout. Right? And what you see is that Sangbae is not able to be defeated by these people. Right? He's constantly in his head fighting that battle to not be defeated. But it's that conversation continuing that keeps him from being defeated, right? He's constantly trying to find the hope, right? He's not just passively sitting back waiting on somebody to make him feel better. He is his own driver of action, That's number one. Number two. And I think the thing that, because you have a lot of people in history who want to make things happen. Only a few are able to actually do it because they can inspire people to get on board, right? And I think the thing that got Sangbae to get all 52 of those other captives on board with fighting him that night was the fact that he had a powerful message. We can get back home if we do it together. You know, it was the messaging. You know, they already knew that their village was strong, right? And it is common sense, 53 people can outpower 4 people any day of the week. But the reason it happened thousands and thousands and thousands of times in the history of the Atlantic slave trade is because the conquerors allowed, they didn't have Sangbaes out there to deliver that message of together we can overtake them. They stole that voice even in the moment to prevent people from like that from having any power, you know. But Sangbae was able to get his message through. He convinced the people that we are strong. I'm not any stronger than you, but you're strong and we're stronger together, you know. And that message resonated with the people that night. I think and here's where I start getting into the creation of, so one of the characters that I highly included was Callie. Callie was the young boy. But what Callie is supposed to symbolize is that following pack. I couldn't get into all the individual captives and their thought processes, and so I try to use Callie as my representative of that. But it's that these people wanted a leader. Most of them wanted a leader to begin with. And I forgot to mention, so I can't believe I forgot this far, but he was actually the son of the chief. And so I'll explain this because I know this can get a little confusing, but they didn't have countries, right? So Mende Land was a large geographic area that was broken up into individual chiefdoms, right? And each chiefdom had a set of villages. Because I know a lot of people are thinking, oh, chief is in charge of a village. Why is Sangbae the leader of his village, but his dad is still the chief? Because the chiefdom has multiple villages, right? And so Sangbae, not only was he set to be the next chief to take over this whole group of villages, but he was already in charge of his village, right? And so he had that leadership experience, and people were not unaware of that, right? People, that the other captives would have been talking, his story, his prowess would have been known amongst the group, and they were looking for a leader. And so it just fit. Again, everything came together at the right moment. And so when he finally came time to deliver his message, they were ready to take it in.
No, definitely so. And again, how does Stolen Voices convey the emotions and the struggles, Sangbae and the others who were taken from their home?
That's something that I always, so I still hope I did my best job doing, because I hope I am able to get the reader to feel what they felt from an analytical perspective, because I wanted this book originally to be for younger audiences, like the 13 to 18 group. It ended up I didn't finalize it like that, but that was the original idea. And so I didn't want to get too deep into the sadness and all those negative emotions, but they're there. And so my hope is that you can see it, that you can see the pain and the suffering, but that it doesn't cloud your ability to understand why it's important for you to see that. And so hopefully I struck the right balance between eliciting emotion from the reader and explaining the emotion. Let me not shy away from the fact that these people were experiencing emotions that we will never know, right? I try to fictionalize a story that me personally, I will never understand, right? I will never understand what it feels like to go through what he went through. And so all I can hope to do is hope that I captured it even just a little bit. I don't even want to pretend like I captured what he felt like, because I know for a fact I did not do it justice, right? But I hope I at least touched on it.
No, I believe you did. And definitely, as I said, to convey those different themes that we don't normally hear about. And as well, I loved how you, for every chapter, that you put kind of like a parable in there. So that was kind of nice to be able to see. And, DB, as we kind of close out this episode, what are your thoughts that you would like to leave the readers when they're reading your book?
So my first thought is the power of the village. Always understand that together we strengthen each other. It has always been a characteristic of our heritage and our tradition to rely on each other, and we're losing that as time progresses. So let this be a message that together we're stronger than we could ever be divided.
Great. Thank you so much. And as I said, I appreciate your time for coming on and speaking to this. And hopefully, everyone will enjoy it the same way that I have as well. And to have this as a resource. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.